Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into omnibus legislation in the U.S. Congress.
Right.
It's kind of a shortcut, maybe, to understanding a really key part of how Washington works these days.
Yeah, absolutely. We've looked at, academic work, legislative analysis.
And the goal is really just to unpack these huge bills and figure out what they mean for how laws actually get
Yeah,
made.
exactly. The nuts and bolts, specifically these big consolidated packages.
Okay, so let's start right there. What is omnibus legislation, like the basic definition?
Sure. So, simplest terms, it's one single bill, but it combines lots of different legislative items, sometimes totally unrelated stuff.
Omnibus,
Yeah,
like the Latin for everything.
precisely. Everything. And while you can see it used for different kinds of laws, it's really, really common when Congress deals with funding the government.
Ah, okay. So when they sort of lump all those annual spending bills together.
That's the main place you see it, yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of passing each of the, 12 annual appropriations bills one by one.
Which used to be the norm, right?
Historically, yes. Each one had its own debate, its own vote. Now, they often bundle some, or even all of them, into what's called a consolidated appropriations measure.
So one massive vote covers potentially everything.
That's the core idea, yeah. And you hear different terms for variations, too.
Like what?
Well, you might hear minibus. That's when they combine just a few of those spending bills, not all 12.
Okay.
Or sometimes a cromnibus. It's kind of a hybrid. It mixes a short-term funding patch, a continuing resolution, with some of these bigger omnibus-style spending packages.
Interesting. And you said it's not just about funding, though.
Correct. Yeah, funding bills are probably the most frequent example, but big policy changes can get wrapped up in omnibus bills, too.
Like what kind of things?
Things like budget reconciliation bills, which have special rules. Or even, historically, you could argue some landmark laws were omnibus-like in structure. Think Compromise of 1850, maybe.
Wow. Okay. And they get nicknames, too, right? I've heard things like
Oh, yeah. Informally, people call them big ugly bills sometimes.
chuckle slightly.
Okay. Or Christmas tree bills,
Christmas tree. Why that?
because they get loaded up with ornaments, extra things, riders, earmarks for specific projects, things that might not pass on their own get attached to this must-pass bill, like hanging an ornament on the tree.
Gotcha. So unrelated amendments get tacked on.
Exactly. Maybe a controversial environmental rule gets attached to a defense spending bill everyone needs to pass to avoid a shutdown.
So lawmakers might be forced to vote for something they don't like just to keep the government running.
That's often the dynamic, yes.
Okay, so procedurally,
Hmm.
how does it actually work? How do they stitch it all together?
Well, it's basically taking the text of several different bills and combining them into one single legislative document.
One file, essentially.
Yeah, one massive file gets one bill number and, crucially, one final vote, up or down.
But structured inside.
Often, yeah. They'll organize it into divisions or titles that roughly correspond to the original bills. Division A might be defense funding, Division B, labor and health, and so on.
But the sheer size.
Oh, enormous. Hundreds, easily thousands of pages. It's like taking, I don't know, blueprints for 12 different houses and stapling them together.
Chuckles. Okay, that's a good visual. And you mentioned writers again.
Right, that's key. These are legislative provisions that are attached, often completely unrelated to the main purpose of the bill.
Like policy changes. Or specific funding for a project back home.
Both. Could be an earmark directing funds to a specific bridge, or it could be a policy change affecting, say, financial regulations or environmental rules, tucked into this giant spending bill, often without much specific debate or scrutiny.
So why? Why do this? Why go through the hassle of combining everything? Seems complicated.
Well, the stated reason is usually efficiency. Congress has deadlines, especially for funding. Bundling is presented as a way to get everything done on time, avoid those government shutdowns everyone hates.
Okay, efficiency makes some sense.
But yeah, there are definitely strategic reasons too, big ones.
Yeah.
It can be a powerful tool to overcome gridlock. If you can't get votes for something on its own, package it with something essential, like defense funding or veterans benefits.
Ah, the must-pass element.
Exactly. It also helps package controversial items. Things that might not survive public debate on their own can get slipped in.
Provides political cover, too, maybe. You can tell voters you had to vote for the whole package.
Precisely. And it makes it much harder for a president to object to just one part, since the line item veto was struck down by the Supreme Court.
Right, Clinton v. City of New York.
Yep. The president has to swallow the whole pill or veto the entire massive bill, which is usually politically impossible if it funds the government.
So it forces the president's hand.
It can. It also makes log rolling easier. I'll vote for your priority in this section if you vote for mine in that section,
Right.
all within the same bill.
And strengthens party leadership. They control what gets into the final package.
Definitely enhances leadership power, yeah. They're often the ones negotiating the final details behind closed doors.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. It sounds efficient, maybe, a way to get things done.
That's the argument for it.
But it also sounds like it could, I don't know, make things less transparent, less accountable. Does piling it all together actually make it more complex and harder to scrutinize?
That's the core criticism, absolutely. While proponents say efficiency, critics argue these monster bills reduce transparency, kill meaningful debate on specific issues, and centralize power. It's harder for the public, and frankly, even for many lawmakers, to know everything that's buried in there.
And this hasn't always been the standard way, you said.
No, not at all. There was actually a brief experiment way back for the 1951 fiscal year with a single appropriations bill. It didn't go well. They abandoned it pretty quickly.
Really? Why?
Reports from the time suggest it was just too unwieldy, too complex, led to delays, the very things it was supposed to fix.
Huh. So when did it really take hold?
It started becoming more frequent in the 1980s, but it really became the default, almost routine, after fiscal year 1997. That's when Congress started consistently missing the deadlines for the individual appropriations bills.
So it became a fallback, a necessity?
Or maybe a habit.
Mm.
From roughly fiscal year 2012 up to just recently 2024 is pretty much the main way Congress funded the government year after year.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what's the big takeaway for, for you listening and trying to follow Washington?
Well, I think the main thing is just recognizing how dominant this process has become. So much lawmaking, especially how your tax dollars are spent, happens through these enormous complex packages.
A massive shift from how things used to work.
A huge shift. And you see scholars looking at this, right? Some, like Len Krutz, might frame it as an adaptation, maybe necessary for efficiency in a polarized time. Others, like Barbara Sinclair, called this kind of thing unorthodox lawmaking.
Different ways institutions evolve, maybe not always for the better.
Right. So the arguments boil down to, is it efficiency and overcoming gridlock? Or is it reduced transparency and limited deliberation?
Which leads to a final thought, maybe, for you to chew on.
Exactly. Given that such huge chunks of our laws, especially the budget, are now made this way, what does that mean long term?
For the quality of those laws, for the public's ability to even understand what's happening, let alone influence it.
Yeah. Is this just a necessary adaptation to modern politics? Or is it fundamentally changing, what representation and governing actually mean?
It's definitely something we're thinking about.